1945. Canadian tanks attacked Germany's last line of defense west of the Rhine River.
This was one of the heaviest battles on the Western Front during the Second World War.
The Germans are outnumbered and desperate, determined to defend the fatherland at any cost.
I'd rather take a few more enemies with me to the grave. That's what they were saying.
They lure the Canadians into a trap, and the armored advance turns into a fight for survival.
Every move that you make, they can see it, and it was just like shooting fish in a rainbow.
At stake is nothing less than the fate of Germany, as these two forces fight for control of a patch of farmland, simply known as the Hochwald Gap.
All you knew is that you had to kill them.
The Rhineland, fertile farm country in western Germany. Today it's peaceful and serene. But in the winter of 1945, it's the scene of one of the most ferocious and costly battles of the Second World War. February 1945, the Second World War in Europe enters its final months. Allied armor rolls into the German Rhineland, and leading the attack is the 1st Canadian Army. Their objective, the Rhine River, and on the other side, central Germany. The Canadian mission is to hook up with British forces and push east, capturing bridges across the Rhine and the German town of Xanten. They've amassed a major strike force. 90,000 troops, 1,300 artillery pieces, and over 1,000 tanks. Their armored workhorse is the Sherman 5 tank. This 32-ton version of the Sherman has a short-barreled 75mm gun and only 51mm of frontal armor. That means less firepower and protection, but more maneuverability. And the Allies are able to produce thousands of them.
Well, the Sherman was a great little tank, and we had far more of them than the opposition had.
There was lots of them. That was one good thing. And the other thing was they were pretty rugged. They didn't require much maintenance. They were tough.
The Sherman had a short-barreled gun, so they could only damage us at a very close range. The Sherman wasn't as good as our Panther. He had a long cannon. They couldn't compare to the Panther.
The Panther is armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun and is protected by 80mm of sloping frontal armor. And with a top speed of 40 kilometers per hour, the Panther is one of the best designed tanks of World War II. But in the winter of 1945, it's numbers that count, and the Germans are at a disadvantage.
The Allies had so much more equipment, so much better supply for gas, food, and ammunition. We couldn't compete with that, and by 1945, we barely had any tanks left.
To defend the Rhineland, all the Germans are able to field are a handful of Panthers, almost a dozen of the heavier Tigers, and less than 100 anti-tank guns. It's an enormous disparity in men and firepower. But the Germans have another weapon, sheer determination to stop the invasion of their homeland.
The day British and Canadian crossed the border to Germany, the Germans were defending their own country. Each of these soldiers thought not that he was fighting for Hitler or he was fighting for Hitler's regime, but he was fighting for his country, for his people at home.
It's called the fatherland, you know, in their terminology. So you're going to fight a hell of a lot harder than you would under normal circumstances. I was really amazed at the tenacity of it. It was just terrible, the resistance that they were putting up. You knew that they were going to be killed. They knew they were going to be killed, and they fought on anyway.
For many of our men, their homes had been destroyed.
Durch die Bombardierungen. Und die haben gesagt,
And they told themselves, what am I supposed to do at home? I'd rather take a few more enemies with me to the grave. That's what they were saying.
The Allied soldiers had to fight around every farm they saw, every little forest they saw, every little village they saw. They had to fight.
German resistance is ferocious, and as the battle enters its second bloody week, the assault bogs down. In 18 days of fighting, the Allies lose over 8,000 men and hundreds of tanks, while advancing only 25 kilometers. Allied command sends in Lieutenant General Guy Simmons, commander of the 2nd Canadian Corps, to get things moving. He implements Operation Blockbuster, a bold plan for tanks and infantry to attack quickly and at night, seizing the high ground between the villages of Kalkar and Udum. This will clear the way for his main force to cross a valley and overwhelm German defenders dug in along the Hochwald Ridge, their last line of defense before the Rhine River.
The Germans knew the terrain because it's their terrain. Yeah? And so it wasn't so important that they only had 10% of the army of the Allied. It is very easy to hide soldiers in these forests. It's very easy to hold up every soldier who's coming, every tank who's coming. And this made it very difficult to take this ridge as a lookout.
But this is just the beginning of the Allies' problems. They also have to deal with the weather, and spring has come early to the Rhineland.
Da waren 3 Flüsse.
Because of the melting ice, 3 of the rivers were carrying so much water. We also destroyed the dams. And there were 2 other rivers that were carrying so much water, there was no way for them to get through. And there was also a lot of mud.
It flowed over all the roads, all the fences, and your maps became useless because all you could see was endless mud.
Da waren auch rechts und links.
To the left and right of the roads, the ground had turned to swamp, so they had to stay on the roads. They couldn't use the fields. And there, they were easy targets for us.
In the early morning of February 26th, Canadian infantry, supported by nearly 80 tanks of the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, launched Phase 1 of Operation Blockbuster. Their mission is to take and hold the German-occupied Kalkar Ridge, clearing the way for the main attack against the Hochwald on the other side of the valley. It begins with an artillery barrage by 700 Allied guns.
All those guns broke loose, just tremendous fire. The sound of the gunfire and the tremendous volume of it as we were advancing, our own gunfire, it was a sound that was so great, you could feel it on your body. This constant roar, even inside of the tank, you could feel the guns. They make a little more noise when you're in front of them than they do when you're behind them. It was raining very steadily. The ground was just terrible, absolutely terrible. We pressed into the minefields, and the first 3 tanks hit mines. The teller mine would blow your track off, and it would buckle the floor under the driver. And that basically disabled the tank. We reported that we'd hit the minefield, and the 2 IC came on the air and said, "Press on." And I can recall Butler said, "How the hell do you press on when you're in a minefield?" And this is in the dark. You really don't know what the hell you're doing. And we found sort of a little track or trail. And we turned right and went through the minefield basically on a country lane. So the Germans hadn't minded. The loader operator's job really is, like if you're not firing immediately, is to pivot your periscope. And as we progressed, I could see 2 German tanks off as they passed a burning barn. And I yelled into the mic, "German tanks."
They're Panthers, and they're easily able to outgun Hale's short-barreled Sherman.
You knew you can't do anything about it, particularly at a distance.
But the Canadians have some additional firepower. Each troop of 4 tanks includes at least 1 Sherman Firefly, armed with a long-barrel, high-velocity cannon. It's a tank buster, the so-called 17-pounder, able to penetrate 130 millimeters of armor at ranges of almost 1,000 meters.
But the long-barreled 17, you let him go in. You're not going to bother using a 75 against the front view of a German Panther.
The first shot from the 17-pounder hits a barn, and the Panthers retreat in the smoke and confusion.
Typical German tactics. You have the tanks in front maybe, and as soon as the attack comes in, they fire and fire, and then they back away and draw you under their anti-tank guns.
Despite the danger, Hale and his squadron push on to the ridge.
We got to the top of the Calcar Ridge itself, and then all of a sudden, wham, it was daylight.
John Hale and fellow tankers of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers have entered the killing zone. If the Canadians fail to take Calcar Ridge, Operation Blockbuster and the Allies' big push to the Rhine will be over before it really begins. February 26, 1945. Operation Blockbuster is underway. And the fighting is furious from the very first shots. Lieutenant General Guy Simmons sends scores of Sherman tanks into the thick of it. Their mission is to take and hold the heavily defended Calcar Ridge, clearing the way for the main attack aimed at driving the Germans back across the Rhine River. But even though they're outnumbered, the Germans stubbornly stand their ground.
We got to the top of the ridge, and then all of a sudden, wham, it was daylight, and the Germans were shooting. They were being fired on from our left flank and in front. And I can remember particularly this barn on our left flank. And the doors were coming open. And we were yelling at the gunner, the doors are opening.
What Hale has spotted is the infamous 88, Germany's most powerful anti-tank weapon. The 88s fire armor-piercing shells, able to penetrate almost 100 millimeters of steel at distances up to 1,500 meters, and the Canadians are well within range.
I don't know about you or anyone else who's ever looked down the barrel of an 88. When it fires, you can actually see it coming at you. It's like a rolling ball like a fist coming. You can see the sparks coming off of it. It passed over our tank and cut off the aerial within a foot of the tank behind us. Then we instantly fired just as soon as he had fired at us. Looking behind us, the Grenadier Guard tank that was liaison, his tank got hit. There's an immediate fusion of the metal into a cherry red glow where it's hit with a black hole in the middle of it. And the crew commander was coming out the hatch, and the ammunition exploded, and he just sort of threw up his arms and then collapsed down into the turret. There were still 6 of us left on the top, and we were all firing forward and to the left flank. And the Germans started cutting down the farmhouse structure. They were ripping it down, and we were using it for cover. We were pulling out and shooting and so on. We couldn't withstand the amount of fire that was coming at us. We were going to all get knocked out. The infantry had dug in and could defend their position. So we fired a smoke shell for 5 of the other tanks. One at a time, they pulled off the ridge as we blanked the left flank. By that time, the buildings were nearly gone and just burning rubble, and we decided to pull out. And the tank, in the heavy mud, we put it in first gear and pulled ahead, but it sort of snuffled under and stopped. And a German shell fired right across in front of us. And then we started moving forward again, and then finally there was another shot came at us. And Butler was in the turret, and he was standing there, and he just sort of fell on the floor on his ass, and he said, "Oh." And it had a strange sound to it, you know, sort of, it didn't have the crack, it had a whir. And I said, "What happened to that?" He said, "You wouldn't believe it, but that was coming for us, and it hit a hydro pole." We started out with a squadron, and 19 tanks and 1 liaison tank, and we wound up with 6. And that's my first introduction to the Rhineland battle.
More tanks join the attack, and the battle goes on into the next day. Finally, the outnumbered and outgunned Germans are forced to fall back, and the Canadians take Calcar Ridge. With Calcar Ridge secure, armor from the South Alberta Regiment moves forward for the main attack against the next ridge. It lies across a muddy valley and will give this battle its name, Hochwald. General Simmons' plan is for infantry supported by the tanks of A Squadron to advance towards the village of Udon and seize the rail embankment, while B Squadron attacks across the valley into a long gap flanked on either side by thick woods. The aim is to force the Germans back to the village of Xanten on the Rhine River. It's a bold plan, and it's off to a bad start.
When the time came, we moved out. I can still remember driving along, or slithering along, it's more like it. It took hours to go a mile. It was just unbelievable and very frustrating.
They were up to the sponson in mud. And so there we were, supposed to start at 11:30 at night, and we didn't get there till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning because of getting stuck, running out of gas, so on. It was almost daylight by the time they got it started, and you're going into the worst possible situation. You try not to have armor go through draws or files, and here is a wood on both sides, loaded with firepower. And we're leading into this absolute killing zone. To go into that gap the way we did, and it was just like shooting fish in a rain barrel.
The Canadian tanks were plowing through deep mud. We laid our gun on the leading tank, and by the time we were ready to fire, it had already been hit. And we swung our gun to another, but that too stopped. The third tank at which we aimed fired first. And the shell burst only yards in front of us. Quickly, we realigned our gun. The tank seemed to falter, and we fired.
We were just moving towards the position, and the incoming fire was such that you just could not exist there. To see these soldiers still trying to go forward and being hit is soul destroying.
While B Squadron takes a beating at the Hochwald Gap, A Squadron advances towards the rail embankment running through the village of Udom. It's the only piece of high ground in a sea of mud.
It was what they called a right hook to go around Udom and try and establish a front by the railway crossing. Supposedly the town looked pretty vacant, but all the time you don't take that for granted. Anything that moved, we were shooting it up. The terrain was terrible. It was a real effort to get to our objective. Then on top of it, we had the traps. If you fell into one of those, you were finished right there. And here we were coming out onto a dike area, and unknown to us, on either side of the dike were big, deep ditches. The way those tank ditches were designed, as you were coming around, you'd eventually lock on to one of those roads. That was a little piece of high ground from the mud, and so we probably chose to take that. And then when you get on it, then of course you can't get off it. And we just fell right in line. And that's the worst thing that could ever happen to an armored column. And they were just waiting for us. You know, we were sitting ducks.
The countryside near the German town of Udom shows little sign today of the ferocious battle that took place here. But during the final months of the Second World War, this quiet place was a battlefield. February 27th, 1945. Canadian Sherman tanks, avoiding minefields and mud, advance along a narrow dike, attempting to secure the railway embankment running through the town of Udom.
We just fell right in line. And that's the worst thing that could ever happen to an armored column, is to have your tanks one behind the other. The Germans had placed a lot of Tigers embedded down in the ground area, and anti-tank guns, and they were just waiting for us. Eddie, he was at the front, saw the Tiger, and I guess he knew that the Tiger was drawing a bead on him. Eddie loaded up an AP, and he shot that out. According to him, he says the shell just bounced right off its hide. And so he knew that he had to go to stage 2, which was get that opening.
The German Tiger is a 57-ton monster. It's built like a battleship, protected in places by more than 100 millimeters of steel plate. The Tiger seems indestructible, but it has a weak point. A narrow gap in its armor where the turret meets the hull. A shell strike there can put it out of action.
He did. He managed to jam the Tiger.
But it does no good. The Canadians are caught in a trap. The Germans have prepared a perfect ambush.
And it was just very fast. They just took out the front tank, they took out the back tank. They just took every other tank out. We were hit in the soft spot, like in the back. It was very abrupt, deafening, instant. Right off the bat, then you jump into action. You got to get out. You know that baby is burning. She's brewing up. We were fortunate, managed to get out. Corporal McGivern looked and he saw the old girl was burning up pretty bad at the back end, so he says, we got to get out of here. And he looked over and he says, there's a farmhouse. He says, it's a short distance away. He says, we'll make a run for it.
They reach the farmhouse only to be captured. Trooper Gardner and his tank crew spend the final months of the war in a prison camp. They're the lucky ones. In the first 2 days of battle, hundreds of Canadian soldiers die, and hundreds more are wounded. Grim proof of the fierce defense put up by the Germans.
When you were there at the time, you didn't understand why they were fighting so hard. You didn't know why they were fighting. You didn't have time to understand what they were doing. All you knew is that they were fighting, and they weren't surrendering.
Each of these soldiers believed that each day they could hold their position, would help their country, because it was so close to the industrial center of the German Reich. Most of the war industry was there.
Die Armee hat gekämpft,
The army was fighting to prevent any enemy from entering the Fatherland. That's why we were fighting so hard.
Haben sie sehr stark gekämpft.
On the morning of February 28, the Germans strike back at the Canadians' most vulnerable point, the Hochwald Gap. The Canadian tanks and infantry push into the gap and take ground near the western end. An advance force of Shermans moves forward to the midpoint in the gap. And the Germans pounce with Panther and Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns. Gunner David Marshall witnesses the attack.
Over the rise in front of us came the snout of 2 tanks, a Tiger and a Panther, heading our way. When our gunners had them in our sights, and before the German tanks could level out to bring their 88s down on us, our tanks opened fire, with all guns blazing. We stopped the attack, destroying the Panther and forcing the Tiger to retreat.
The Germans strike again and again, and the Canadians struggle to hold their ground. But just when their situation seems desperate, help comes roaring in from the skies.
The weather started to get better, and the fighter bombers came firing rockets. The typhoons were dangerous for us.
The typhoons would range in above you, behind you somewhere, with 20mm cannons. When they're converging on the target, then he lets go his rockets. And it's just a hell of a noise, and all you see is pieces. It'll break a Tiger or a Panther, break them to pieces. So they're very helpful.
The Typhoons, or Tiffies as the tankers call them, stop the German advance with their rockets. But in battlefield chaos, anything can happen, as Canadian tanker Bill Luton recalls.
A sound was heard overhead unlike anything I ever experienced in battle. Something like the noise of a high-speed train passing through a tunnel. I paused in wonderment, and then heard an explosion. I looked up to see the Tiffy flaring away.
Luton and his crew are under attack by the deadliest tank killer on the battlefield. One of their own Typhoon fighter bombers. The Battle of the Hochwald Gap enters its third bloody day, and it's a standoff. The Germans won't back down, even though they're outnumbered and under attack by Allied warplanes. Rockets from Typhoon fighter bombers shred the Germans' dwindling supply of tanks.
They were dangerous, these Typhoons, attacking every tank.
The Typhoons swarm the Hochwald Gap, and in the chaos, one of them targets a Canadian tank.
A sound was heard overhead unlike anything I ever experienced in battle. I paused in wonderment, and then heard an explosion.
There's nothing Bill Luton and his tank crew can do but release canisters of yellow smoke to identify themselves as friendly.
Smoke blossomed gloriously on both sides of the tank, and just in time. But no, he kept coming, and dove directly at us. I saw a great puff of smoke and instinctively ducked inside. A futile gesture against a rocket. Again came the sound of the express train in a tunnel, and again the explosion. We were still alive to hear it. The Tiffy had missed again.
The Typhoons attack all morning, blunting the German attack. At noon, Canadian tanks push forward in another attempt to clear the Hochwald Gap. But again, they are stopped by German tanks and artillery. That night, tanks from the Canadian Grenadier Guards try again. But the Germans have perfect aiming points on either side of the gap. Tracer rounds light up the sky, and the Guards are caught in a crossfire. By the time it's over, they have gained no ground and lost 10 tanks.
We had the numbers of troops, weapons, and so on our side. But a very well ensconced enemy on the approaches can make you pay dearly, no matter if you have the odds.
Dawn, March 1st. The battle enters its fourth day, and the Canadians are still only halfway through the Hochwald Gap. German tanks and anti-tank guns in the woods on either side of the gap will have to be taken out one by one. That means attacking with tanks through the trees.
Fighting through two forests is an absurdity, just an absolute absurdity. You should never do it. The biggest problem was the Panzerfaust, was the one-shot rockets that they had.
Panzerfaust means tank fist. It's small, highly portable, and lethal. It fires a 140mm shaped charge at ranges of up to 60 meters and can penetrate 200mm of armor, tearing a hole through the tank and unleashing a devastating explosion inside.
He could hide in the wood. All he needed was an opening. He's got a big target, and once he hits that tank, there's a chance he sets off the ammunition in it, or starts the tank on fire, or he has wounded at least one or a couple of the crew.
They'll knock out a tank just like that, bingo. I don't think tanks are that useful, but that's what you had. We were going through with the Fusiliers Montreal into the forest in daytime. And 4 tanks were in line ahead, which is not very effective, instead of being spread out. The major of the Fusiliers Montreal wanted us to use HE against this group of Germans in a clearing that was in front of us, which was our objective.
The Sherman 5 carries 2 main types of ordnance: armor-piercing shells for use against tanks, and HE, or high-explosive rounds for softer targets.
You'd have to be careful and use the shock action more than the weapon. The ground shakes like an earthquake. But the Germans were protected. If you brought fire on them, they had overhead cover. And as soon as the shelling stopped, they're back into position, throw the sticks and what have you out of the way, and they're ready for business.
The field artillery observation officer, he called in a crumpet 25-pounders. And all of a sudden, they came in and they landed on that clearing. Just the most magnificent shooting, and they just plastered about 10 or 15 rounds right in front of us.
The heavy artillery clears the Germans, and the battle continues for the next 36 hours, with tanks and artillery making small gains against fierce German resistance. Then, on the morning of March 4th, the battlefield is silent. During the night, the Germans have fallen back, leaving the Hochwald Gap for the Canadians. The Shermans advance, and their objective, the village of Xanten on the Rhine River, comes into view. This is where the Germans will make their last stand. For the exhausted and battered Canadians, the fighting is far from over. The Hochwald Gap, a remote patch of farmland in western Germany. In February 1945, this was the scene of one of Canada's most brutal and costly battles of the Second World War. After 5 days of fighting, the battle comes to a swift and surprising end. German forces retreat in the night, leaving the gap and the woods on either side to the Canadians.
This is an art that the Germans have, and we should really basically learn by it, because they have a habit of putting on a tremendous show so that the last thing you can think of is their withdrawing. But that's what they do. But they leave people in position who then are very aggressive with their weapons.
And they left 2 tanks, 2 Panthers. One was giving the other covering fire. One would sit there and poke at anybody who showed up on top of the hill. The other guy had turned around and going like hell the other way. My buddy Ed was there, and Ed looked at the situation because he didn't put his tanks over the top. He kept them behind the crest, what they call sort of a turret down position, because they could kill you. They could put a shell in the front of a Sherman and it'll come out the back. And he could do it 3 miles away. And Ed looked at the situation and figured out, well, maybe I can get these both if I do it right. So he give gunner control, and the gunner will drop the breech on his gun and look through the gun barrel and watch the gun crest clearance, and he gets his sight on the tank. When he's got crest clearance, then he fires. The dangerous one was the one that was facing him because it has the heavier plate in the front, and it has the gun in the front, which still could get him. In that first tank, he was backing up along a little narrow road with ditches on the side, and he accidentally backed the back corner over the ditch, and it tipped up the next plate. It was just a flat plate, not very thick.
The 45-ton Panther has 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, making it almost impenetrable. But its underside is only 30 millimeters thick and very vulnerable.
He could see what was happening and studied the thing, and he hit it right bang in the middle of this plate. So he just kept firing. This tank brewed up, and I don't know if people get out or not. But the other one was going the other way. The gun was pointing away from him, and the back of a Panther tank is not thick. It's probably 3 inches. Put one round at on the other tank, and he ricocheted off the deck and took the commander's head off. Everybody hopped out of that one that could hop out, and that tank was left there.
With that, the last remaining obstacle in the Hochwald Gap is out of the way. And the Canadians push forward to the outskirts of Xanten, their final objective. This is where the Germans have set up their last line of defense. But it's just a matter of time before they are overwhelmed. Allied warplanes mount a series of heavy destructive bombing raids.
Every day, every night, there were bombings of the city. The city, which was, before of that, never attacked, now was destroyed by about 85%.
I remember the bombings very well. We had to go down to the cellar very often. We heard the alarm sometimes in the middle of the night, and we were really scared. It was terrible. We heard the ordnance rumbling and watched the planes dropping bombs. There was a lot of destruction. There were dead horses lying all around. This was a terrible experience for us.
On March 7th, a month after the fighting in the Rhineland began, and 8 days after their costly attack through the Hochwald, Canadian Sherman tanks roll into Xanten. They capture the bridges over the Rhine and open the way for an all-out Allied advance into the German heartland. Germany will surrender in less than 2 months.
This battle here in the Rhineland is one of the forgotten battles of World War II. It was the Canadian British Army who opened the gate to Berlin.
In the end, the casualties on both sides are appalling. The Germans lose 40,000 killed and wounded. And for the Canadians, the fighting in the Rhineland, including the Battle of the Hochwald Gap, became their bloodiest campaign in the entire war.
The Rhineland, in terms of casualties, basically 5,300 dead and wounded in, shall we say, 30 days. Like, that surpasses D-Day, it surpasses the worst of the Scheldt.
Strange enough, there isn't a sense of elation. It's more, thank God it's over, because coming to mind is the people that have been lost, the price paid, and that this is not the end.
June 6, 1944, D-Day. Canadian Sherman tanks and infantry land on Juno Beach in Normandy under murderous fire.
There were so bloody much tanks burning that you were just in a bloody jungle.
You saw one of your tanks in front of you hit. You didn't know what was happening. You kept going, you kept going.
The Canadians overwhelm the Germans' coastal defenses and advance inland.
I thought, wow, this is a breeze. We'll be on our way to Berlin next week.
Only to come turret to turret with the most ruthless killers in the German army. The panzers of the battle-hardened SS.
There was really no need to fear a Sherman. They were easy opponents for us.
This is armored warfare at its bloodiest. The Battle of Normandy.
Finally, I said, fire.
Juno Beach. 8 kilometers of gently sloping shoreline along the coast of Normandy. In the late spring of 1944, this was one of the beaches where the greatest amphibious operation in history took place. The Allies' all-out attack on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Since the fall of France in 1940, the Germans have been preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion. Building a 5,000-kilometer chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. This Atlantic Wall is considered impregnable, with kilometers of concrete bunkers, tens of thousands of mines and anti-tank obstacles, and protected by over 3,000 big guns. This impressive defensive line seems a most unlikely place for an attack, but on June 6, 1944, that's exactly what the Allies do. At 0300 hours, a force tens of thousands of men strong approaches the Norman coast and unleashes a massive naval bombardment.
All of a sudden, they started firing. There was a British cruiser right behind us, and these 6-inch guns fired right over our heads. And my God, a 6-inch gun when it fires. I sure got my back like a window blind. Scared the hell out of me.
You could see it falling on the towns way up in front of you and pounding all over the place.
Operation Overlord is a joint Allied attack. and the Canadian objective is 8 kilometers of heavily defended coast, codenamed Juno Beach. Leading the assault is the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade. Their mission, neutralize the German defenses and secure a beachhead for the infantry. At 0800 hours, the Canadians launch their attack, and leading the way are scores of amphibious tanks.
They gave us all the basic training of preserving a tank in the water. We did the drill. Let the water come up and so on, don't get panicked. First man that gets out is the driver. Stands on the back after you got to steer this bloody thing, see?
The DD, or swimming tank, has a sealed lower hull to keep it from sinking, and it gains extra buoyancy from high canvas skirts. But its most unique feature is its duplex drive, twin propellers that push it along at a speed of almost 4 knots. The DD is an ungainly 30-ton monster and is slow and hard to maneuver in rough seas.
The skipper said, okay, we're going on the run-in, be prepared, and in we went. And of course, it's an awkward bloody thing to steer because it doesn't work very well in the tide and the wind, and it was an awfully rough day.
The 5-kilometer run into Juno Beach is harrowing and lethal. High waves sink the tanks, as do underwater mines. As they near shore, they come within range of the Germans' well-placed guns. Of the 67 tanks launched from the landing craft, 11 never reach shore. Those that do have to lower the canvas skirts under heavy fire before bringing their guns into action.
There was confusion. It looked like chaos. And there were a lot of vehicles, but they were all moving as they were supposed to.
During the first hours of the battle, the Canadians lose hundreds of men and 19 tanks.
I saw Canadians lying on the beach, some of them with stuff thrown over them.
Despite their losses, they overrun the German defenses and take Juno Beach. By the end of D-Day, the Allies have breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall along 80 kilometers of Normandy coastline and have begun their advance inland. Their strategy is to encircle and destroy the German forces in occupied France. The Americans are to swing west, while British and Canadian forces head south toward their next objective, the strategically important city of Caen. But scarcely have the tanks of the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade rolled off the beach when they encounter a new kind of peril, the picturesque Normandy landscape. It's a maze of narrow fields, 5-meter-high hedgerows, and sunken lanes. A tanker's nightmare. Maneuvering a tank through this is difficult and dangerous. This is nothing like the wide open desert of North Africa or the steppes on the Eastern Front. In Normandy, the fighting is at close range, making surprise absolutely vital.
The first idea you get is, for Christ's sake, get out in the field and start moving.
Suddenly, you're up against the Normandy hedge, which is 14 feet high. It's on a 2-foot-high bank. You go crashing through it. And you go down into a sunken road 4 feet deep. You go across the road and you're into another Normandy hedge.
Very difficult to get into and very difficult to get out of. And you can get hung up in the hedge and you're totally vulnerable at that point. But if you don't have a plan, you'll get nailed. Because the enemy always has a plan.
D-Day +1. Despite the difficult terrain, Canadian tankers of the 2nd Armoured Brigade make steady progress towards Caen. And as the battle enters its second day, they encounter a column of 9 German Panther tanks. The Panther is considered one of the best tanks in the Second World War. Its long-barreled 75mm cannon is deadly, even at long range. It's protected by 80mm of frontal armor, welded at a steep 50-degree slope, making it almost invulnerable to frontal attack.
The Panther was, and this was pretty well known, the most functional and best tank in the war, based on 3 components: gun velocity, cross-country mobility, and armored protection.
Geländegängigkeit und Panzerschutz.
But those advantages won't help these Panthers. Their frontal armor won't do them any good. They're side on to the Shermans and highly exposed. The Sherman has a short-barreled, less powerful 75mm gun and thinner 51mm armor plating, making it vulnerable in a head-on battle with the Panther, but deadly at close range if they catch the Germans off guard. For wireless operator Phil Lawrence and the other rookies of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, this will be their first head-to-head encounter with the enemy.
We heard from the infantry that there were some Panther tanks coming. And the tanks were fairly close. They're about 900 yards, 1,000 yards away. And meanwhile, I'm trying to wake up my gunner. The captain got us all lined up. Each of us was given a target. And I'm kicking in the legs to try to get some life into him. By this time, the order to fire has been given. And my gunner is fast asleep.
June 6, 1944, D-Day. Canadian tanks and infantry land at Juno Beach in Normandy, under intense fire. They take heavy losses, but overrun German defenses and move inland. The Allied plan is to encircle and destroy the German forces in Normandy, with the Americans swinging west, while British and Canadian forces push south towards the strategically important city of Caen. Leading the Canadian advance are the tanks of the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade. A few kilometers inland, they encounter a column of German Panther tanks.
The tanks were fairly close. They're about 900 yards, 1,000 yards away. By this time, the order to fire has been given, and my gunner is fast asleep. It's very scary. And the crew commander is batting him with his head with his hands to wake him up. He said to the gunner, you useless son of a bitch, you are now the co-driver trying to get in there and don't get in anybody's way. And finally, he traversed around and fired. You know, the tank was up on its springs, and the gun recoils and runs out, and the turret fills up with fire and smoke, makes a tremendous row. It's very scary. It wasn't so much a battle as it was an ambush. Those poor buggers never knew what hit them. I mean, one minute they're riding along, one behind the other, and the next minute, you know, everything's on fire. They fought them in a way that we thought was kind of stupid. They used to sit side on.
The Panther has just 50 millimeters of side armor, about half as much as it has in front. Head-on, a Panther can withstand almost any Allied attack, but catch it side-on and at close range, and it's very vulnerable.
We could knock them off easily. All 9 Panthers were knocked out like that. I thought, wow, this is a breeze. This is a great, I like this. We'll be on our way to Berlin next week.
But the Canadians are about to get a surprise of their own. Rushing to meet them with orders from the German High Command to stop the Allied advance are units of the newly formed 12th SS Panzer Division, led by some of Hitler's most experienced tank commanders. The 12th SS is equipped with 48 Panthers, dozens of heavy guns, and almost 100 Panzer IVs.
The SS were a rough lot, but they were very good at what they did. If you make a mistake, they'll kill you.
We knew that it was our duty as soldiers of the German Wehrmacht to serve, whether we thought it would be successful or not. This was none of our business.
The 12th SS, also known as the Hitler Youth Division, is led by Kurt Meyer, a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, with a reputation as an aggressive and ruthless tank commander. His troops call him Panzer Meyer.
Battalion after battalion arrived. The soldiers waved at me. They were moving forward to their baptism of fire in a calm manner. They showed no self-pity. They were determined to prove themselves.
D-Day +1. Kurt Meyer and his panzers take up positions in the historic 12th century Abbey d'Ardennes. There in the monastery gardens, the 12th SS Panzer Division lies in wait for the tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, who are supporting the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, slowly advancing en route to Caen. From high atop the Abbey Tower, Kurt Meyer can see them coming.
He climbed up the tower of the Ardennes Church. The Abbey is 67 meters above sea level. The church itself is 26 meters high. He was able to see all the way to the western end of Juno Beach.
The terrain as far as the coast was spread before me like a sand table. The whole expanse looked like an anthill.
He noticed the Canadian troops advancing.
I then saw what was happening. My God, what an opportunity. I issued orders to all battalions, the artillery and the tanks. Fire on my command only.
The squadron stopped, they had snacks, they ate. The Canadians had no protection of their flank.
The tanks were right across the front of our regiment. The barrels of our guns were pointing at them. Then I gave the signal for the attack.
All of a sudden, bang.
Caught off guard. They seemed totally surprised.
There was so bloody much smoke and tanks burning that you were just in a bloody jungle.
D-Day +1. Over the last 36 hours, the Canadian 2nd Armoured Brigade has broken out from their Normandy beachhead and begun to battle their way inland. Rushing to meet them are tanks of the 12th SS Panzer Division, led by the infamous Kurt Meyer. His forces take up position in the Abbey d'Ardennes. There, the 12th SS set a trap for the tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, now slowly advancing toward the city of Caen.
All of a sudden, bang. From then on, the battle started. So bloody much smoke and dust and tanks burning that you were just in a bloody jungle.
The Canadians are caught by surprise. Within seconds, the lead tanks of the Fusiliers column are destroyed.
Our commanding officer needs some more strength forward, and he asks my squadron commander to send up a troop of tanks, 4 tanks. And he asked for another troop. So now there's my squadron commander, myself, and the 3rd tank, and that's all we got. And then the message comes from him saying, the Germans are breaking through on your left. Move over to your left. And he still thought we had a squadron, I guess. All of a sudden, the action started to move around our way. And at first I saw the tanks, and they were at about, 1,000 yards away. Each one of us, you had the jitters every time you saw the buggers because the gun was so much superior.
The Panzer IV carries a powerful 75mm cannon. And although it has a shorter barrel than the Panther, a shell from a Panzer IV can still rip through the weak armor of a Sherman tank.
The Sherman was an easy opponent for us.
Wenn man sie auf
If you were able to keep your distance, then there was no need to fear a Sherman.
The short-barreled Sherman doesn't have nearly as much punch as the Panzer IV.
You have to start playing the game of tactics. And I start firing my smoke in front of it.
Along with high explosive and armor-piercing rounds, the Sherman is also equipped with white phosphorus incendiaries. These shells can be used by tankers to mark enemy targets or fired to create smoke screens to provide tactical cover.
And they were at about 1,000 yards away. And I said, Christ sake, let them come in close. And watch the right-hand corner where I just put down the smoke, because you may see something come around the corner there taking a look at us. And sure enough, you see a tank just sticking his nose around, looking, trying to get some view. Finally, I said, fire. And I hit him at about, oh, it must have been in 800 or 900 yards, I guess. I can always remember the thing actually burning.
It's Radley Walter's first tank kill. By war's end, he will have 17 more, and recognition as Canada's leading tank ace. But on this day, the Canadians take a beating. They lose 28 tanks, 110 men killed, and 128 taken prisoner. 18 of the captured are delivered to a terrible fate.
The first group, which was mostly the North Nova Scotias, were brought to this courtyard here. These Canadian soldiers would have come up these stairs and into this park. They came along here. At the top of the stairs, there was an SS. Who would kill each one with a bullet in the back of the neck.
The ruthless Kurt Meyer and his 12th SS Panzer Division have all but stopped the Canadians in their tracks. All along the northern front, the Allied advance slows to a crawl. The British and Canadians planned to take the city of Caen in 3 days, but it takes them 34. The fighting is the bloodiest they have yet seen. To break the German stubborn resistance, the Allies take drastic action and send in heavy bombers. Massive daily air raids reduce much of the ancient Norman city to rubble.
What happened was that Caen City was totally obliterated.
On July 9th, D-Day plus 33, the Allies finally enter Caen.
Our tank advanced down one of the main streets of Caen, only to find that we were driving into huge multiple bomb craters. Some of them were so big that the Sherman tank, which is 11 feet high, was actually going down underground. On one occasion, we came to a total stop, and I got up on the top of the tank, and I couldn't see where would be the normal ground level.
There's rubble everywhere, But no Germans. They've withdrawn, leaving the ruined city to the Allies, who become bogged down in the wreckage created by their own bombs. The Germans have retreated south of Caen, digging in along a 5-kilometer stretch of high ground known as Verrières Ridge. The ridge rises 30 meters above the lowlands, making it an ideal defensive position for the Germans. From here, they can command the area all the way north to Caen, making it a killing ground for the advancing Allied armor. The Germans deploy their arsenal, including 72 88mm anti-tank guns, 40 Panthers, and 80 heavy Tiger tanks. Even though they are facing one of the most formidable defensive positions in Normandy, on July 18th, 9 days after entering Caen, British and Canadian forces launch Operation Goodwood, an armored assault aimed directly at the Germans on Verrières Ridge. And once again, the tankers of the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade are in the thick of it. Their orders? Take and hold a small Norman village at the foot of the ridge.
I remember being in a place called Saint-André-sur-Orne. They had reported that there were 64 German tanks in Saint-André. We said, well, that means there's probably 8 tanks. We tend to divide about 1/8 of what they reported. So we thought to be safe we'd send in 12. It was raining and you couldn't see very well. Very hard to make anything out. We got in there and by God, there were 64. There were tanks everywhere.
July 9th, 1944. After 34 days of fierce fighting, battered British and Canadian forces finally enter the heavily bombed Norman city of Caen. 9 days later, they are ready to continue their advance and link up with U.S. forces routing the German army in southern France. But German forces in the north are far from defeated. 8 kilometers south of Caen, they dig in along Verrières Ridge with masses of anti-tank guns and hundreds of tanks. The ridge is now one of the strongest defensive positions in France. July 18th, 1944. Combined British and Canadian forces launch Operation Goodwood, aimed at driving the Germans off the ridge. On the western flank of the attack are the tankers of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, with orders to seize and hold the village of Saint-André-sur-Orne.
They had reported that there were 64 German tanks in Saint-André. We said, well, that means there's probably 8 tanks. We got in there and by God, there were 64. There were tanks everywhere. And we couldn't get organized to take them on. And there was a lot of people getting knocked out. It was raining and you couldn't see very well. Very hard to make anything out. We seemed to have lost touch with everybody. We decided we better try to find a safe position and some targets. We found an excellent position. There was a stone building on our right, so we were covered from view and from fire from the right. You could hardly see us for this hedge. There were 9 Panthers out about 1,000 yards or so, side on. I had taken one last look out of the turret because I'm still having trouble with the mist and rain and whatnot. And a Tiger tank came around the corner of the building, saw the position, thought, that's a great position. And they pulled in to stop right in front of us. It was just the scariest damned apparition I've ever seen. Just loomed up like that. We were almost touching one another. So I had an AP up with spout. I fired that and hit him. It just bounced off. And after that, we just fired a high explosive as fast as we could. About that fast. I was literally just holding the firing button down. The gun was firing, recoiling, running out, firing, recoiling, running out. And my loader operator was flinging the shells in, and then he fired back.
The Tiger weighs 57 tons, almost twice as much as a Sherman. It has 100 millimeters of frontal armor, making it almost impregnable. It carries an 88 millimeter gun that can destroy a Sherman more than 2 kilometers away. And this Tiger is practically on top of Lawrence's tank.
There are no words that can convey the incredible violence of that strike. The AP shell that hit our turret, it looked as if someone had taken a torch and just burned the channel front to back. Drive reverse, hard right. And our co-driver was driving, and he wasn't a very good driver. And he went to go into reverse, he revved up the engine. The real driver grabbed the hand throttles, and then he just grabbed the gear shift lever and rammed it into reverse and yelled into the face of the co-driver, let out that clutch and get the hell out of here. And so we went shooting back.
The Sherbrooke Fusiliers lose half their tanks and are forced to retreat. Other units suffer similar losses and pull back. Operation Goodwood is a disaster.
The British sent 800 tanks across that open ground just south of Caen, and 400 of them were knocked out. The Germans were up on the Bourgebus-Verrières ridge and were able to see for miles and miles. And along those miles, the Germans were entrenched in farmhouses, hidden away with their big guns, able to see everything that moved, able to cover the whole area with their 88 millimeter, their famous anti-tank guns, which were anti-aircraft guns, supposed to fire at aircraft 20,000 feet up in the air, but firing at us 200 yards away.
On the 21st, the offensive against Verrières Ridge is called off as the enormity of the losses sinks in. In just 4 days, the Allies lose over 6,000 men and more than 300 tanks, and the Germans still remain firmly in control of the ridge.
Now, our task was to go up that hill and find a way in which we could get through those German lines, which are now reported to be possibly one of the strongest defenses that the Germans set up anywhere in World War II.
The Allies are desperate for a breakthrough. Canadian Lieutenant General Guy Simonds comes up with a bold and risky plan to take the ridge. Codenamed Operation Totalize, Simmons' plan calls for 400 tanks to quickly advance in 6 columns straight into the German defensive positions. And to reduce the effect of the German big guns, he will launch the attack at night.
If one asks, what did one see? The simple answer is nothing.
July 21st, 1944. After taking enormous casualties in 4 days of bloody fighting, the Allies canceled their massive armored offensive, aimed at eliminating the stubborn German defenses along Verrières Ridge. Lieutenant General Guy Simmons comes up with a new plan. The Allies must take the ridge because a breakthrough is key to the overall campaign in Normandy. Codenamed Operation Totalize, it calls for 400 tanks, supported by infantry, to rush forward in 6 columns, headlong into the German guns. To reduce the effect of the guns, Simmons plans to strike under the cover of darkness. A nocturnal armored operation on this scale has never been tried before, so Simmons orders his infantry and tanks to practice the attack in daylight over and over again.
Getting ready for Totalize was basically about a week of really studying how to put it together. They put 1, 2, 3, 4. They made up 4 columns. Behind those 4 tanks, they put 4 more. Behind that, they put 4 flails. Behind that, another 4 flails. And then 4 companies of infantry in armored personnel carriers. Everything tracked, not one-wheeled vehicles at all.
11:30 hours, August 8th. After a massive bombardment, Operation Totalize begins. 400 British and Canadian tanks lurch forward into the darkness.
So you were in a mixture of sentiments. You were afraid, you were proud, you were thrilled, you were bewildered.
The tanks stay close together, crawling slowly toward the ridge, following lines of tracer fire that point the way to each unit's objective.
And all you saw was the red tail light of a tank in front. So you fixed your eyes on that red tail light and you followed for your life's sake.
And the buggers would be putting in mines knowing reasonably well where we were and which way we might come out against them.
Total chaos, with flashes going on all over the place, shells exploding.
You hear the shooting going on all over the damn place.
On the way, you saw some Germans in slit trenches, but you've been told not to stop, to keep going. You saw one of your tanks in front of you hit and going up in flames. You saw another one hit, going up in flames. You didn't know what was happening. You kept going, you kept going.
By dawn on August 8th, Canadian and British forces have captured most of Verrières Ridge. By noon, the entire position is in Allied hands. Phase 1 of Operation Totalize is a success, opening the way for the Allies to advance and hook up with U.S. forces further south. On August 21st, after 2 more weeks of fierce fighting, the Allies finally complete their encirclement of the German army in Normandy. those Germans who remained trapped inside the pocket are now easy prey for the Allies' superior air power.
And for a while, this tremendous slaughter, you can only call it, went on.
More and more bombers and fighter bombers attacked. The misery around us screamed to high heaven. Refugees and soldiers from the defeated German armies looked helplessly at the bombers flying continuously overhead. It was useless to take cover from the bursting shells and bombs. Concentrated in such a confined space, we offered once-in-a-lifetime targets to the enemy air power. Death shadowed us at every step. We stood out like targets on a range. It was impossible to miss us.
The destruction of the German army in France marks the end of the Battle of Normandy. German losses are horrific. 200,000 are killed or wounded, and 1,300 tanks are destroyed. Normandy has become a graveyard for the once mighty German panzers. Of the 12th SS Panzer Division, only 10 tanks and 300 men are reported to have escaped, including Kurt Meyer, who was later put on trial for war crimes, including the killing of 18 Canadian prisoners at the Abbey d'Ardennes. But he spends just 9 years in prison. For the Allies, the Battle of Normandy is a great victory, but it comes at a steep price. 50,000 men are killed, and over 150,000 are wounded. In the Battle of Normandy, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers suffer some of their heaviest losses of the war. Many still wonder how they survived.
You know, I've been in tanks that were knocked out, but the shell didn't hit where I was. I've been in mortar barrages, but no mortar came down where I was. It's just dumb luck. I think everybody would agree on that. You got to be skillful, you got to be thoughtful and careful and all of that. But if you're not lucky, you're not going to make it.
Lorraine, France, September 1944. U.S. General George Patton's 4th Armored Division seems unstoppable as it rolls towards Germany.
We were an avalanche of fire and movement.
But Hitler strikes back with hundreds of dreaded Panther tanks.
The Panther was a real big thing. Made you feel pretty secure riding on one.
The American Sherman tanks used tactics to avoid destruction by the superior German armor.
It's not a matter of just firing. We have to think.
At stake is the Allied invasion of Germany and the end of the war in Europe. Two giant armored forces collide in one of the biggest tank-on-tank clashes of the war. This is the Battle of Arracourt. Normandy, 1944, almost 2 months after the D-Day invasion. Allied forces finally break through fierce German resistance and begin to roll across occupied France. The drive towards Nazi Germany has begun. British and Canadian forces advance in the north, while the Americans strike south and east. Spearheading the attack is General George Patton's 3rd Army. Patton, considered one of the greatest field commanders in U.S. history, leads a powerful force of more than 160,000 men. 1,500 artillery guns, and 930 Sherman M4 tanks. The M4 is armed with a short-barreled 75mm gun with an effective range of just 800 meters and is protected by only 51mm of frontal armor. It's vulnerable, but light and fast, able to reach speeds of up to 40 kilometers an hour. That speed makes the M4 the most maneuverable tank on the battlefield, ideal for Patton's rapid thrust across France. Leading the advance are the tanks of the battle-hardened 4th Armored Division.
We had mission type orders, and the best classic example of a mission type order was Patton saying to us, "Go east and go like hell." So starting about the 16th of August, we went like hell.
We would be moving 20 to 25 miles an hour down the road. We would recon by fire with the bow gun shooting one direction and the coax machine gun shooting another. So we were an avalanche of fire.
When we hit resistance, if we felt it was going to take us time, we just pulled back and bypassed. And at that time, the tankers' byword was bypass and haul ass.
The American advance is fast, powerful, and relentless. Vastly outnumbered and suffering huge losses, the Germans are forced into full retreat.
The big advantage was material. The Sherman M4, you could destroy 100 of them, there were 120 more. They never ran out of men either.
Patton's forces overwhelm the Germans, who keep fighting desperately as they retreat.
German units had by then already fought some battles with the Americans. We drove past those and onto the road. The road looked like an abattoir. Entire German platoons had been killed by airstrikes. We drove around the bend, and all of a sudden we stood in front of an American tank, which was ready to shoot. And as soon as I moved the barrel, he started to fire at us. It was our luck that the gunner was nervous and fired at the slanted panel on our bow. The shell just bounced off and did no damage.
Protected by 80mm of frontal armor, the Panther is almost invincible to head-on fire, and its 75mm cannon has a higher velocity than the Sherman's, making it deadly even at long range.
And he only got one chance to shoot at us. He didn't get a second chance. Our shells went right through their armor like it was butter.
Der amerikanischen Panzer
American tank crews used to say, we in the Sherman are only suicide candidates against the Panther.
Sind gegenüber einem Panther nur Selbstmordkandidaten.
But even the best tank of the Second World War is not enough to hold off the large number of Shermans in Patton's strike force.
And in front of us on the field, there were anti-tank guns and tanks.
Waren Pack und Panzer.
The big battle started, and we got hit a few times. Their soldiers must have been nervous or inexperienced, because they kept hitting us on the front plate, and none of the hits had any effect on us. We brought down 3 tanks there. There were probably more, but during all that chaos, it was hard to tell. So then I continued on for a bit, And just before I got to the corner of these two roads, I saw a Sherman. But it was going so fast that it went straight across the road and ended up with its front end in the ditch on the other side. We wanted to shoot, and then one of the worst things that a tanker can experience happened. My electric firing malfunctioned. You just want to hang yourself or drown yourself when that happens. And then we realize he's going to fire at us as soon as he gets out of that ditch. And just as I turned my head, 4 more Shermans drove onto the road, and we couldn't defend ourselves.
Longonki is forced to retreat. While all across France, German soldiers are doing the same.
It was a pursuit, and we were moving faster than they could retreat.
By summer's end, the relentless American air attacks, combined with Patton's massive armored assault, brings the Third Army within striking distance of the German border.
My tanks advanced from the middle of August to the first day of September when we crossed the Meuse River. My tanks had advanced 328 miles in 12 days. So we were euphoric.
But that euphoria is short-lived. On September 1st, the 4th Armored Division is suddenly stopped in its tracks.
On the 2nd of September, no orders. So we sat 2nd, sat the 3rd, we didn't know what happened. But on the 3rd day, we learned that the reason we were stopped was gasoline.
The speed of the American advance has come at a cost. After 5 weeks of fighting, the Third Army has outrun its own supply lines and is forced to halt just west of the Moselle River. All they can do now is sit and wait for fuel.
And we knew that each day that we didn't move, that was giving time to the enemy. That's the most valuable commodity on the battlefield, time. And the Germans were masters at reorganizing. So we thought we had a window of about 5 days. If we sat for 5 days, we were going to start hitting resistance because they could gather their forces.
The Germans take full advantage of the lull and gear up for a massive counterattack that will turn into one of the biggest tank-on-tank battles of the Second World War. The Lorraine, a quaint and rustic region of eastern France near the German border. Armies have fought here for centuries, but nothing comes close to the ferocity of the fighting that took place here in the late summer of 1944, when this became a killing ground in one of the largest tank-on-tank battles of the Second World War. September 1st. General George Patton's American Third Army has pushed the Germans nearly 1,000 kilometers across France and now approaches the Moselle River, the last natural barrier before Germany. But just as they get within striking distance of the fatherland, a fuel shortage stalls the American advance. And the 4th Armored Division, Patton's lethal spearhead, is forced to sit idle.
And we knew that each day that we didn't move, that was giving time to the enemy. That's the most valuable commodity on the battlefield, time.
The German army is in desperate shape. Since the Allied invasion in June, Germany has lost 400,000 men and now has just 200 serviceable panzers. Soldiers in the field struggle to keep up morale.
Soldier never knows what's going on, except what's going around, immediately around him. We still had faith. We still knew that we were going to win the war. We were told, you know, there's just something coming down the pipe that'll frighten them so bad that they'll swim back to New York.
Hitler has been gambling on the development of new wonder weapons to turn the tide of war in Europe. But their development has been slow, unsuccessful, and unable to match the speed of the Americans' advance. Hitler has one last chance at stopping the American juggernaut. Throughout 1944, German factories have been producing tanks in record numbers for the Eastern Front. Hoping to buy more time, Hitler diverts these freshly minted tanks to the west and creates new formations called panzer brigades. They're equipped with 135 Panzer IVs, 280 Panthers, and are supported by more than 14,000 infantry called Panzer Grenadiers. Among them is 18-year-old Heinz Altmann.
The idea was to have fast-moving small units available as kind of fire brigades. They were intended to be used in the east. They were used in the west because that was all available at the time to stop the Allied advance to the Rhine.
Hitler's plan is to encircle and destroy Patton's stalled Third Army, and then quickly advance northwest to drive a wedge into the Allied front line. In advance of the main attack, the 112th Panzer Brigade is ordered to head off the Americans, just west of the Moselle River, near the French village of Dompierre.
The assignment was to attack Patton's Third Army in the flank from the south. We rode on tanks as Panzer Grenadiers. We rode on a tank. Panther was a real big thing. Made you feel pretty secure riding on one. We advanced until evening came and stopped for the night. We dug in the hills on either side of the valley, and the tanks stayed on the bottom in orchards. And what happened was, in the morning, the French notified the coming Allies. Here were these almost 50 tanks. The French 2nd Armored called in an airstrike. We didn't have any anti-aircraft protection in the brigade. These aircraft came and attacked the tanks. It was a terrible sight that we saw from our foxholes. The thing that stays in my mind was a tank being engulfed in napalm. And the crew comes out, they drop to the ground and roll around. Terrible sight, seeing a human being burned to death. And by late afternoon, we had lost most of our tanks. So by the next morning, we had something like 8 tanks left out of the almost 50 and retreated with the tanks. The Panzer Brigades didn't have their own artillery. They did not have their own reconnaissance units. The danger is you don't know where the enemy is. And the enemy knows where you are. It's like fighting with your eyes covered.
The main attack has not even begun, and the 112th Panzer Brigade has already lost nearly 80% of its armor. It's a blow to German plans, and worse is to come. By September 13th, the now refueled 4th Armored Division crosses the Moselle River and resumes its advance towards Germany. In response, Hitler changes his plan of attack and rushes to meet the advancing Americans.
He wanted us pushed back over the Moselle. He wanted to set up the Moselle as his winter defensive line. So he threw everything that he could gather at us at that particular time.
September 19th, 1944. Heavy fog rolls in across the Lorraine, grounding American warplanes. At dawn, the Germans attack. The advancing tanks encounter small pockets of American resistance. The sound of gunfire alerts a platoon of American M18 tank destroyers. They move forward, expecting to encounter a small force, only to find themselves face to face with more than 40 German tanks, including dozens of deadly new Panthers. September 19th, 1944. In a desperate bid to stop the American Third Army's advance towards Germany, Hitler launches a massive counteroffensive aimed at forcing the Americans back across the Moselle River. In the early hours of the attack, the 113th Panzer Brigade surprises and overwhelms scattered pockets of American resistance. The Battle of Arracourt has begun. A platoon of 4 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers moves through heavy morning fog towards the sound of gunfire. The Hellcats reach the battlefield and come up against 40 tanks of the advancing 113th Panzer Brigade. With the destroyers, or TDs, is Private Paul Colangelo.
After we realized they were German, we started to open fire. We would shoot and move. With our speed and maneuverability, we were having a field day.
Each combat command usually had one company of TDs. They could penetrate the front slope plate of a Panther. So they were lethal.
Armed with a high-velocity 76mm cannon, the Hellcat is designed to quickly engage and destroy enemy armor. It has a top speed of close to 100 kilometers per hour, but that speed comes at a cost. The Hellcat's armor is only 13 millimeters thick, making it highly vulnerable to enemy fire. The Germans quickly exploit that weakness and knock out 3 of the 4 Hellcats. But Colangelo and his platoon have bought enough time for 4 more Hellcats to arrive. Leading the reinforcements is Captain Tom Evans of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion.
As the fog burned off, we saw at least 30 to 40 German tanks start up towards us in a frontal attack. We waited and waited, then we fired. The leading 2 tanks were hit and stopped dead, aflame. The others, their crews apparently confused, turned sideways. That's where they made a big mistake. From our position, with only turrets showing, we hit 11 more as fast as we could load and shoot. It was a turkey shoot.
By mid-afternoon, 8 Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion have knocked out 19 Panzers. The German attack ends in failure. It's the same story almost everywhere along the front. American forces holding back large numbers of advancing German tanks. But just outside the village of Arracourt, the Panthers punch through American lines, threatening the headquarters of the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A. Tank Commander Jimmy Leach and his company get an urgent call for help.
The Germans had a couple of brigades of tanks attacking CCA.
Leach's company arrives just in time. They find the American headquarters caught off guard, defended by only a few artillery guns.
The artillery was shooting direct fire at them and had them stymied at least. They had not spotted CCA headquarters. Their vehicles could be seen, I reckon, from the German position. But the Germans were concentrating on the artillery shooting. And Clark said, "Where's your company? I sent for you, ages ago." They said, "I want you to get rid of those damn tanks right there. You see them? Get rid of them." "Yes, sir." "Drive them away." I said, "All right, I want us to deploy just beyond this point here, right here now. Deploy right out here in line formation and move toward these Germans, guns a-blazing." Well, when we emerged, guns a-blazing, the Germans turned tail and left the battlefield. And man, they took off. Went several thousand meters to the right and got up on a high hill. We should probably go look for those bastards. Why don't we, before dark, move in that direction?
Leach quickly rallies his men, and with his small Sherman force, launches a pursuit of the Panthers.
A Company went around the left on a high ground and then dropped down. And here was a German logger of over a dozen Panther tanks. A Company immediately started shooting at them, and they returned fire to A Company. We lost 3 Shermans. A Company lost its commander and 2 platoon leaders. Their armor protection was superior to ours. Their hitability, superior to ours. But we had the smoke round in the 75. The advantage of the smoke round was to screen the target where he couldn't shoot back at you, blind it, and then try to maneuver to the flank and get a flank shot into it.
A Company's frontal attack is costly for the Americans, but it allows Leach's tanks to strike from the side, targeting the Panthers' thinner, more vulnerable side armor.
I gave by the left flank. Let's go. When I dropped over, we were right in the middle of them. I hit them broadside. I'm giving a fire command. Gunner, traverse right, steady. And when I get on a tank, I said, fire. We would be firing shot ammunition at these tanks. Shot is a solid round, anti-tank round.
The M61 is an armor-piercing round designed to punch a hole through heavy armor. Traveling at 620 meters per second, an M61 round can easily penetrate the Panther's 50 millimeters of side armor.
If I'd have hit them on the front like A Company did, they would have been bouncing off. But I hit them on the flank, and my guns would go right through the side of a German tank. Together, A Company and my company knocked out 9 Panthers.
By the end of the first day, the battlefield is littered with the hulks of 43 German panzers. The Americans lose just 5 Shermans and 3 Hellcats.
General Patton analyzed what was going on, and they thought this was just a skirmish that the Germans had thrown at us, and it wasn't the real thing. It was a pretty good skirmish. It lasted a day and a half of heavy fighting, tank versus tank. And he ordered a continuation of the attack to the northeast toward the Saar.
The bulk of Patton's forces resume their advance towards Germany. Jimmy Leach and his company get orders to stay behind, near the French town of Moncourt.
I was to be the rear guard. as they pushed on away from me. And suddenly, to my right, the Germans reappeared in spades in tanks again.
September 20th, 1944. General George Patton's 4th Armored Division has been fighting off a massive German offensive aimed at driving the Americans back across the Moselle River and stopping their advance towards Germany. The Germans throw hundreds of new Panzer IV and Panther tanks into the battle. But the Americans, with their fast and agile Shermans, inflict heavy losses. Believing the offensive has petered out, Patton orders the advance towards Germany to continue. The 37th Tank Battalion rolls out and heads east, leaving behind the Shermans of B Company, commanded by Captain Jimmy Leach.
I was to be the rear guard as they pushed on away from me. And suddenly, to my right, the Germans reappeared in spades in tanks again.
They're tanks of the 111th Panzer Brigade, responding to Patton's move east with a surprise attack on the American rear, just outside the village of Moncourt.
So I commenced a long-range firing, shooting at the Germans, and stalled them off a little bit. I ordered my exec and I both to dismount and go look over this hill. While I'm dismounted out in front of my own tank, up toward Moncourt on our right, a tank fired at my tank and missed it. I didn't have time to mount, so I motioned my tank to back up. There was a building nearby. And they fired a second round and they missed again. Why, I don't know, but Boggs, my driver, stopped. That was all the Germans needed. Now they got a steady target. And the third round went right through the right side of the tank, knocked the head off of my driver, Boggs, and cut Popovich, my bow gunner, in half. But at this point, Abrams engaged that tank that knocked me out. Well, he missed that damn tank, but he cut a furrow near it and the tank backed off and left. Abrams was well respected by every man in our division. I admired him for his strength and leadership abilities.
The bold and aggressive tactics of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams will earn him a reputation as one of America's greatest tank commanders. Leading the 37th Tank Battalion, Abrams will become the #1 American tank ace of the Second World War.
He didn't lead the attack. He didn't do that. But he was among the group of tanks that were in the attack. He was one of them. He could have been knocked out just like any one of us.
By nightfall on September 20th, the Americans have repelled the German attack. But the Germans have taken Moncourt and pose a threat to the American flank. Abrams gathers his forces and with daylight fading plans a bold and risky move. He'll strike Moncourt when the Germans least expect it, in the dead of night. It goes against all the rules of tank warfare, but it works. Caught by surprise, the Germans are all but wiped out. With the bulk of the German forces destroyed, the Americans consolidate their front and begin mopping up.
We were retreating in the face of American advancing, and got into Morcel, small village to the south of Louisville. Then late in the morning or early in the afternoon, they began to shoot fog into our field of fire. That, of course, meant that there was an attack taking place. And we started firing into the fog. There were 2 or 3 tanks that advanced on the road. One of the guys who had dug in let go with a Panzerfaust anti-tank grenade. I don't know how he could have missed. He was right next to the tank, but he missed. The tank made a left turn, it buried him by pivoting the tank around the tank track around the hole, and that was that. Then orders came through to retreat, and I did. I went down the embankment to the big farmhouse. Everybody had left. I was the only one that seems to have been left behind. I went around the corner of the building, looked down the main street, and here was an M4 tank, oh, I'd say 50 feet away from me. That scared the hell out of me. It was bigger than an elephant, and very menacing. And it seems that his gun was pointed at me. I just got scared. It was so big, I got scared. If I'd had a Panzerfaust, I could have picked that guy up like nothing. But I didn't have it. All I had was a machine gun. I started running with the machine gun around my neck. That tank scared me. I still suffer from that scare.
By the end of the 4th day of fighting, the Americans have destroyed 2 entire panzer brigades. The Germans are on the run, but they're far from finished. Repeatedly beaten back by the tanks of the 37th Battalion at Arracourt, the Germans turn their sights northward. They target the town of Chateau Salient, now occupied by the 8th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division.
We've been holding high ground, dominating ground, holding terrain. We were stabilized. This is an unusual situation for us. We were an offensive weapon, and we were good on the offense. Now we were in the defense. They were probing, they were shooting artillery at us. But somehow we sensed that they were building up to something bigger. And sure enough, at first light, we looked out, and there was this big patch of woods, Chateau Salient, and out of the woods started coming tanks. We started firing everything we had at them. We fired the medium tanks, the tank destroyers, massive fire as they came out, so they knew immediately they were going to have a fight.
The Lorraine Valley, a small pastoral province along the French-German border, known for its quiet fields and forests. But it was here for 10 days in September of 1944 that the Battle of Arracourt took place.
We are here on the site of the Battle of Arracourt. We can see the landscape as it looked at the time. There are not many traces of the battle left here. Here's an example of the objects that you can still find, but they're very rare.
cet obus de 75 avec sa fusée.
Here's a 75mm shell that we found between two tree trunks. It's been here for more than 60 years. And it's still there. No one has been able to remove it.
Voilà donc.
It's one of the few traces left of the battle that once took place here.
Shermans of the 8th Tank Battalion of the American 4th Armored Division are defending the town of Château-Salins.
It was on the morning of the 24th of September. It was another foggy day, gray, miserable, raining, ceiling zero. I had everything that we could get our hands on. I had my medium tanks. We had a platoon of tank destroyers with us. We had all this lined up along the ridge, feeling that we were going to be attacked. And sure enough, at first light, we looked out, and there was this big patch of woods, Château-Salins, and out of the woods started coming tanks. And these were mostly Panthers, but they were interspersed were Tiger tanks.
The Tiger is one of Germany's biggest and most fearsome tanks. Its 100 millimeters of frontal armor make it virtually impregnable at long range, and its 88 millimeter cannon can destroy a Sherman tank at a distance of more than 2 kilometers.
It has the best gun that was created in World War II, the 88, which makes it a fearful gun. So when it's head-on, if it's tank versus tank, it has a tremendous advantage. And they had another big advantage. The sky was so gray that there was no air. We couldn't call on air support. So they had that advantage. The minute they came into range, even before they came into real knockout range, we started firing everything we had at them. Massive fire as they came out, so they knew immediately they were going to have a fight. So what our tanks would do, they'd rise, go up to the hill, just high enough so that the gun was above the ridge, fire 2 or 3 rounds, move back, and then move to the side. Sure enough, as soon as he moved, bang, bang, would come around in the area where he had just left. And they'd hit the top of the ridge and ricochet off. The most terrifying sound I've ever heard is an 88 hitting the ridge and ricocheting. Deafening, frightening sound. They kept advancing, little by little, and we kept firing. Every now and then, we'd see a flash, and we knew we'd hit them. And we were losing tanks. So this got to be sort of a seesaw. It was only a question of whether they would prevail. At that point, it was almost a tie. And then we noticed suddenly a little crack in the sky, a little daylight. And the next thing we knew, down came the Tactical Air Force. They apparently had been flying overhead, waiting for an opening, and the minute they saw this little opening, down they came. They started hammering away. They were strafing and bombing. Boy, we can't give them enough credit for the way they operated in support of us. And at that point, the Germans said, no, this is too much. And the ones that were still able to function moved back.
The Battle of Arracourt continues for 5 more days. But Hitler's beleaguered armored brigades cannot break the stubborn American defenders. By the end of September, the Germans retreat back towards the Rhine. General Patton's 4th Armored Division has won the Battle of Arracourt.
Nous sommes le 29 septembre.
On September 29th, the Battle of Arracourt ends with the victory of the American tanks over the last German tanks near Réchicourt-la-Petite.
Côté de Réchicourt-la-Petite.
9 Panthers were left burning in a field near the woods outside of Réchicourt.
À proximité d'un bois qui se trouve à la sortie de Réchicourt. Nous avons acquis ce...
We acquired this tank, which is a Sherman of the same type which fought here,
pour maintenir la mémoire de ceux qui
to maintain the memory of those who fought here,
et pour témoigner notre gratitude
and to show our gratitude for the freedom we still enjoy.
In less than 2 weeks of fighting, the Germans lose 200 tanks and assault guns, almost 75% of their original force. And thousands of men are killed, wounded, or captured.
It went badly for several reasons. One of was completely inexperienced top leadership. The whole planning at the time was so makeshift. There was such poor coordination operationally on the top level. We didn't have any training. We didn't even know each other. That was one of the major disadvantages of these new Panzer brigades.
The German soldier couldn't be blind to the reality of the situation that they were on the losing end. They were just losing too much ground overall on both fronts, you see, just moving back toward Germany.
But the American victory in the Lorraine comes at a price. 225 men are killed and 648 wounded. 41 Sherman tanks and 7 Hellcat tank destroyers are lost. The 4th Armored Division seals its reputation as America's elite armored force, and for the rest of the war, they are known as Patton's Vanguard.
It gave us notoriety in the Corps and in Third Army. It was a significant victory because we became extremely well-versed and trained in anti-tank warfare and tank versus tank warfare. We did a beautiful job of keeping the pressure on them.
That was the biggest tank battle of World War II. I can't think of another one. Sitting here now, looking back, unbelievable. But I'm very, very proud that I've been there. If I'd be asked to do it again, I would do it. I can't believe I was there. I can't believe I did what I did. It's a very strange feeling.
Western Russia, 1943. Vast German and Soviet armies clash in history's greatest and deadliest tank battle.
The earth was trembling, as if there was a huge earthquake.
2,500 German panzers and assault guns face more than 5,000 Soviet tanks. By the time it's over, the casualties will reach more than 200,000.
The gunners told me later that all they saw were grey walls. They were just firing and firing.
The earth and sky were burning.
This is the bloody Battle of Kursk.
Tanks were on top of tanks. Soldiers on soldiers. Sheer terror.
July 5th, 1943. Day one of Hitler's Operation Citadel. More than 800 German tanks roll across the Russian plain towards the town of Kursk. Waiting for them are the Soviets, defending their homeland with the biggest tank army ever assembled. This is Hitler's final attempt at turning the tide of war on the Eastern Front. A war that for the last several months has been going very badly for the Germans. Since their disastrous defeat at Stalingrad in February of 1943, Soviet forces have been relentlessly battering the Germans, forcing them into a 180-mile fighting retreat back towards Germany. By the end of the winter, the German army on the Eastern Front is shattered and teeters on the brink of destruction. But Hitler is determined to reclaim the initiative in the East, and he makes plans for a massive counteroffensive. His plan is to launch a large-scale pincer maneuver to cut off the Soviet-held salient, centered on the industrial town of Kursk. The goal? Encircle and destroy the 500,000 Soviet forces in the Kursk Bulge. But the battlefield is huge. 200 kilometers long and 150 kilometers deep, most of it rolling farmland. In the wide open spaces of the fabled Russian steppes, it's ideal for tank warfare. It's a formidable objective. And over the spring and early summer, the Germans amassed 2 entire army groups. 780,000 men, close to 10,000 guns, and 2,500 tanks. An immense force that will shake Mother Russia to the core. But this buildup has not gone unnoticed, and as the Germans prepare for Operation Citadel, so do the Soviets.
Now the enemy is gathering its massive power. He wants to gain revenge for their defeat in Stalingrad. So our commanders decided to regroup in the spring and regroup us in preparation for defense. Either we would attack right away or by defending and exhaust our enemy.
To meet the impending German attack, the Soviets build up almost 2 million men, 25,000 guns, and more than 5,000 tanks. And all across the Kursk salient, they dig in.
We had several lines stretching about 300 kilometers or so along the front. And the earth was so dug up. We had about 400 kilometers of trenches. The army and civilians working on making anti-tank ditches, which tanks would not be able to get out of. And also in the places where the tanks were in danger of getting through, we made minefields. And that wasn't just in one place. It was almost along the entire length of the defensive lines. We had anti-tank guns, and they were amazing. And of course, tanks.
The backbone of the Soviet Armored Corps is the T-34 medium tank. With a 76mm main cannon and 47mm of sloping frontal armor, The 31-ton T-34 has a deadly balance of firepower, protection, and mobility. By the summer of 1943, Soviet factories have produced tens of thousands of them. And all across the Kursk salient, the T-34s move into position. July 5th, 1943. After 3 months of preparation, the Germans are finally ready for their attack. 1 hour before Operation Citadel is to begin, Soviet gunners unleash a massive artillery attack on German positions.
All of a sudden, such a huge noise started, you could go deaf from it. The earth was trembling, as if there was a huge earthquake. Germans were astounded. They never expected this from Britain.
As it was dusk, it looked like fireworks. When the Stalin Orgel exploded, the barrage was so intense, it actually destroyed the position. This caused lots of casualties right from the beginning. But something must have happened, as it was impossible for the Russians to figure the time of the attack, exactly 1 hour prior to the planned attack.
But the Soviets knew the time of the attack to the minute. They'd captured a team of German sappers who revealed it under interrogation. The artillery barrage causes chaos in German lines and delays the launch of Operation Citadel. But only for 1 hour. Shortly after dawn, the Germans attack.
A masses of tanks, about 500–600 were coming, a horrid amount of tanks.
The German tanks were advancing towards us. Each tank carried 20 to 30 devils, and all of them were drunk like shoemakers.
And that's when all hell broke loose.
The earth and sky were burning. Tanks were on top of tanks. Soldiers on soldiers. Armageddon. But we kept our word. No backing away, not even a step. For Stalin.
By the end of the day, the Germans have made only modest inroads into the vast network of Soviet defenses along the Kursk salient. In the south, the German 4th Army's panzers advance only 20 kilometers, while in the north, the 9th Army has fared even worse, with gains of only 10 kilometers at a cost of dozens of tanks and more than 1,000 men. So far, Operation Citadel is going nowhere. And now, Soviet forces along the northern shoulder of the Kursk Bulge prepare to counterattack.
Tanks from the brigade moved forward. Can you imagine a field, an open field, and you are driving towards each other? Whoever gets whoever first. The enemy position had 56 tanks, and in front of us we counted 17 Tigers.
The Tiger is the German Army's biggest tank. Encased in over 100 millimeters of armor, it is practically impervious to frontal attack. But it is the Tiger's 88 millimeter cannon, with a range of more than 2 kilometers, that makes it the deadliest weapon on the Kursk battlefield.
And the horrible epic battle began. Half of our tanks were lightweight. They ran on gas, and they would burn up like candles. I'm sorry, but here you can't. I came out of the bushes from the battle, and behind me, the Tigers. So I fired about 2 times at a time. Our tank had 76 millimeter gun. It didn't penetrate their tank. But our anti-tank unit was close by, and they finished him. We began destroying each other. Huge losses, but the enemy had huge losses too. The Germans would come this way about 4 or 5 times. My lead was open, so I could look out and find the target. And in jumps the commander of my battalion. His tank got hit, and it burned out. Enemy infantry surrounded him, so he decided to hide in mud. And as soon as he jumps into my tank, I get hit. His head is just ripped off. I was drenched in blood. Spray, everything was all over. As soon as you see the anti-tank gun pointed towards you, as soon as you can, just shoot and get him, or else you die. And I ran over all of them, along with their entire crew. And that's the kind of hell it was on July 6th.
In less than 2 days of fighting, tens of thousands of men die on both sides, and the hulks of hundreds of tanks lie in the burning fields around Kursk. And it's only the beginning. The Germans now prepare to strike again. Their target, the small rural village of Ponery, a quiet railway stop that is about to become ground zero in one of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War. July 5th, 1943. In an effort to change their fortunes on the Eastern Front, the Germans launch a massive armored offensive against Soviet defenses on the plains of Western Russia. The objective of Operation Citadel is to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the bulge around the industrial town of Kursk. The Soviets put up a stubborn defense against the advancing panzers. There are heavy losses on both sides, and by the end of the second day, the Germans have made only modest gains. Now, more than a day behind schedule, and determined to take Kursk, Field Marshal Walter Model launches a new assault. His target, the railway town of Ponery. Ponery is on the main line between Arracourt and Kursk, making it a central collection and distribution point for farms in the area. If Model and his 9th Army are to take Kursk, they must first take Ponery. But Soviet Field Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky knows the strategic value of the town. He digs in with a massive force of tanks and guns and lays thousands of mines. Little Ponery Station now becomes the most heavily fortified point along the entire Kursk salient.
То есть вот с этих полей сюда, в сторону лесного массива, двигались немецкие танки, за танками шла пехота врага, и вот эти пехотинцы, сидящие в окопах, наши стрелки. Рокоссовский, готовясь к оборонительному сражению, поставил задачу перед саперами создать 3 линии обороны. Все 3 линии обороны были глубоко эшелонированные, много рядов окопов. Она имела заграждение из колючей проволоки, и обязательно очень много между вот этими колючей проволокой, между окопами располагалось очень много минных полей.
The artillery and tanks were dug into the earth. This is front of us is a dugout where tanks would be buried. Such dugouts we would call caponera. It contains 3 sharp walls and 1 flat entrance. The tank would drive into it so that its turret and main tank gun were level with the earth. The tank itself would be a lethal weapon against the enemy, and this particular territory found itself the very epicenter of the battle.
The Germans and Soviets engage in a vicious seesaw battle for control of Ponery. The town changes hands 5 times in a single day. The Germans send wave after wave of panzers into the fight. Many are destroyed by mines, T-34s, and anti-tank guns. On July 9th, the Germans attack northeast of the village, striking Soviet positions on high ground, designated on their maps as Hill 253.5.
Our division, the Sturmgeschütz 177, joined the others on July 9th. We were supposed to attack a hill that was occupied by the enemy. We used assault guns, infantry, and 1 unit of brand new Ferdinand tank destroyers.
The Ferdinand is Germany's newest self-propelled gun, never before used in battle. It's a 65-ton monster with 200 millimeters of protective armor plating and twin 300-horsepower engines that move it along at 30 kilometers an hour. But its most dangerous feature is its 6-meter-long, high-velocity 88-millimeter cannon.
And we had big hopes for these tanks, which were able to shoot with their 88mm cannons at a distance of 3,200 yards. The Ferdinand could not handle the ascent of the hill. We thought they had got hit by artillery, but after they caught fire, one after the other, we assumed that the engines were overheated and exploded. The crews got out and ran away. And once again, we depended on the Sturmgeschütz.
The Germans' most widely produced assault gun is the Sturmgeschütz, or Stug. Built on a Panzer III chassis, the turretless Stug is armed with a high-velocity 75mm cannon and is Germany's most successful tank destroyer.
The attack started, and we drove across a minefield up the hill. The Russian artillery was attacking us like hell. Our commander was standing in the hut to show us that we have to spread out. He got hit and was killed. One of the tanks got hit on one of the trucks, and the truck flew off.
Although they lose more than half of their Stugs, the German advance breaks through Rokossovsky's first line of defense.
We fought our way across the first row of ditches and took the second row of ditches, and the Russians retreated. There was a very narrow turn, and immediately behind it, there was a Russian anti-tank gun. Those who managed to escape were shot by the infantry. Shortly behind the next turn, there was another anti-tank gun. We could not react that fast. All I could call out to the driver was, "Hit it full throttle."
July 9th, 1943. The Battle of Kursk enters its fifth bloody day, with the German Ninth Army still unable to penetrate the Russian defenses in the northern sector. The Germans, desperate to complete their drive to Kursk, launch an enormous armored assault on the strategically important town of Ponery. Their goal? Seize the high ground northeast of the village, known as Hill 253.5.
We fought our way across the first row of ditches and took the second row of ditches, and the Russians retreated. Shortly behind the next turn, there was another anti-tank gun. We couldn't react that fast. And all I could call out to the driver was, "Hit it full throttle." We drove towards the anti-tank gun and managed to more or less crush it. We managed to move forward quite far, and a tank appeared in front of me. T-34 was approaching us fast. And we fired the first shot with the anti-tank shell. The shell bounced off, and we were afraid that our shells might not have the power to destroy a tank at this distance.
The T-34's 47 millimeters of frontal armor is sloped at a 60-degree angle, enabling it to deflect oncoming shells and giving the equivalent of almost 75 millimeters of head-on armored protection.
But the tank had been shocked and moved sideways. he managed to shoot it in the side, but it blew up right away. Our tank shells had the ability to punch through tanks. They only exploded shortly after piercing the tank's steel wall. Therefore, the destruction of the tank and its crew was guaranteed.
By the end of the day, the Germans finally capture Hill 253.5, taking heavy losses, but inflicting worse on the Soviet defenders, who fight to the last man.
The German demons were aiming to have the Soviets panic and leave. But our soldiers, with our general's command, did not even shudder. We were not afraid. Soldiers didn't think about putting their life to an end. If they had to slide under a tank, they did just that in order to save them.
The strategy of the Russian tank troops was, to put it like this, stubborn. Stubbornly, they were attacking at the same spot, over and over again. Although former attacks had been fended off and lots of tanks were standing on the field, burning. And the next wave followed, and the next one.
No stepping back. Those were our orders.
Before the battle, each soldier, each officer is forgive me, but everyone wants to leave. And when the enemy started their attack, this is when the battle went on. Everything is fire. Everything is smoke. Just like the old saying goes, as thick as the smoke in a crematorium. That's how it was. There is a particular way of dealing with and battling tanks, which is the same for all tanks. Everyone had a goal of letting the tank come as near as it could to you and shoot into the most vulnerable places on the tank. There is no point in shooting into the head of the tank because it had about 100-150 millimeters of armor. You always aim to destroy its sides. I would shoot at the tanks with armor-piercing shells. I would see that I hit the German. But the missile itself bounced off and went upwards. In that time, the enemy tank aimed at me and shot at me.
July 11th, 1943. It's been 6 days since Hitler's Operation Citadel began. And his massive panzer armies have made only modest gains. In the south, the German 4th Army, spearheaded by 3 elite SS Panzer divisions, has penetrated just 50 kilometers into the Kursk salient. And in the north, Model's 9th Army has advanced only 20 kilometers towards Kursk. In order to finally achieve a breakthrough, Model prepares for one final attack and commits all of his remaining reserves, hoping to finally crack the stubborn Russian defenses at Ponery.
Just like the old saying goes, that's how it was. Everyone had a goal of letting the tank come as near as it could to you and shoot into the most vulnerable places on the tank. There is no point in shooting into the head of the tank because it had about 150 millimeters of armor. You always aim to destroy its sides. I would shoot at the tanks with armor-piercing shells. I would see that I hit the jackpot. But the missile itself bounced off and went upwards. In that time, the enemy tank aimed at me, shot at me, but didn't get me. I managed to hide in the bushes. If I hadn't, I would have been destroyed. So I came out, and I was behind a burning Katyusha rocket launcher.
Я за нее, наверное, несколько, говорят, спрятался, когда и остановился, что можно было и сходу стрелять. И почти не в лоб, так почти в борт.
Then I shot and got the tank in the side armor.
Попал,
you see the entire crew jump out.
Так.
Once the tank was down and burning, the German tankers would climb out and we would react right away. We'd kill them, so there the tank would be burning and beside lay 3 to 4 dead bodies of German devils.
After almost a week of intense fighting, the Germans are exhausted and battered, and they haven't even taken Ponery. But they've inflicted huge losses on the Soviets, who seem to have endless reserves of men and T-34s for the fight.
The tanks drove against each other, and there was shooting everywhere. The gunners told me later that all they saw were grey walls, and they were just firing and firing. During the combat, my steering had been damaged. We couldn't move forward and steer. We had to drive backwards to steer instead. And of course, this was an immense handicap. And so I decided to drive back and gave notice to the command post that I was returning to the garage. While I was standing there, a T-34 came at us at full speed. I shot the tank, and it started burning right away. I asked my comrades what had happened. They told me that the Russian tanks managed to break into the weapons reserve troop
leichte Artillerie ihre Stellung bezogen hatte und die wollten die wahrscheinlich vernichten. Und haben es auch zum Teil geschafft. Und jetzt begann
now a tank battle started, the likes of which had never been seen before, and will not be experienced again anytime soon.
What Bose and the rest of the Germans on the northern front are experiencing is just the beginning of a massive Russian counteroffensive, one that will determine the outcome of the Battle of Kursk and will ultimately change the course of the Second World War. The Battle of Kursk enters its second bloody week. The losses on both sides have been enormous. 80,000 men killed and more than 2,000 tanks destroyed. On the northern front, the Germans have lost 21,000 men and 50% of their armored strength. They have no reserve forces left. Model is no longer able to attack. But despite even heavier losses, the Soviets are able to field more than 400,000 men, 15,000 guns, and almost 1,400 tanks. With these deep reserves, they launch Operation Kutuzov.
We received reinforcements. Those units that were really out of shape from the battle and lost too many lives and equipment were relieved. We had a goal set for each division and region. The rest of us went on forward with the attack. That's when the enemy suffered heavy losses. And we started a new operation.
It begins on July the 12th. Their aim is to smash through the largely undefended flank of Model's 9th Army. This attack marks the end of Hitler's Operation Citadel and heralds the beginning of the Russian summer offensive.
All of a sudden, I was standing in a lower area surrounded by bushes and trees and was observing the enemy's flank. After a while, I noticed movement on the other side. The tanks were approaching us. Then, all of a sudden, we heard this strange sound above us.
The Germans are getting help from the air. In a desperate bid to halt the Soviet advance, they throw everything they have into the battle, including the battered remnants of their once formidable Luftwaffe.
Dive bombers were approaching us unexpectedly and attacking the Russian tanks.
You look up and see that he is dropping the bomb. You go inside the tank, close the lid.
Закрыл и ждешь, попадет, не попадет.
But when I came out of the tank, I used to have supplies, some extra stuff, some extra armor.
Знаете, вот эти подкрылки там и все прочее. Ничего не осталось. Как говорят, как общипанная курица, это танк стал. Вот так вот.
The bombs hit the tanks. Created huge craters. The tanks fell into these craters and could not make it out. I wanted to turn as I saw a Russian tank in front of me, 100 meters away. I headed backwards, and all of a sudden we got stuck. We had hit a stump, and the truck spun. We were stuck and couldn't move forward. I jumped out right away to check what was wrong and called out to my two crewmates as well.
Und mit einer Axt haben wir dann mittelgroße Birkenstämme abgehackt und haben die dann untergesetzt unter das Geschütz, dass es höher kam und damit
With an
dann
axe, we
sich
managed to chop up
aushebelte
some
und
logs
praktisch
and
rückwärts
leveled
wieder
the tank free.
freikam.
Then I just shot
Flog in die
and it
Luft.
blew up. The Russian pressure grew stronger and stronger, and we weren't able to hold the front. The infantry had been thinned out, and from our Stug unit, there were only 3, 4, or 5 left fighting.
Es war nicht mehr möglich, den gewaltigen Gegendruck des
And
Gegners
so it was impossible to
aufzufangen,
withstand the immense
aufzuhalten,
pressure of the enemy and
zu festigen.
stabilize the new position.
Operation Citadel, Germany's last Eastern Front offensive of the Second World War, is over. The Battle of Kursk ends on July 13, 1943, but the fighting goes on. Now it's the Soviets on the offensive.
After the freeing of places where the German devils resided, after our bombing and bombarding of those places, all of his hiding spots, all of his camps were ruined, wrecked, and defeated.
They begin a relentless pursuit and destruction of German forces that will continue all the way to Berlin. In 8 days of fighting, over 200,000 men are killed or wounded, and nearly 3,000 tanks are destroyed. The battlefield is littered with the dead and with the smoldering hulks of German and Soviet tanks. But the true cost of the battle cannot be measured just in terms of soldiers and tanks. For the real price of war on the Eastern Front has been paid by every man, woman, and child.
I remember all the tragedy. It was in what year? In 1943? That's when the Battle of Kursk was. Everything was destroyed. There was nothing left. They would hang out people. Everyone was dying. What can you say? The field, the entire countryside was filled with dead soldiers. Everything was ruined.
From behind, you could hear lots of screams. Help! Mama! Don't leave us here. Take us with you. And I stopped and we loaded as many wounded men up on my tank as possible. I encountered lots of terrible things.
What else can I tell you? There is so much to put it all into words. It was colossal. You can't describe it. Bodies lying everywhere. But with our spirit, we defended our mother.